in the heart of the Frankish Empire, where power was often as fleeting as the clouds above. A young woman was born into a world of political strife and ever-shifting allegiances. Her name was Richilde, the daughter of Boso, a nobleman whose ambitions stretched across the borders of Italy and Provence. The year was 855, and the great Charlemagne's empire had long since fractured into warring kingdoms, each ruled by his descendants who struggled to hold onto the fading glory of their grandfather's conquests. Richilde's early life was shaped by this turmoil. From the moment she could walk, she was surrounded by the whispers of power. Her father, Boso, was a man with a vision, one that involved elevating his family's name to the highest echelons of Frankish nobility. It was no secret that he had grand designs for his daughter, hoping that her beauty, intelligence, and royal lineage would allow her to form alliances that would ensure his own ambitions were fulfilled. At the age of 12, Richilde found herself caught in the turbulent web of political marriage. The court of Charles the Bald, King of West Francia, one of the surviving sons of Charlemagne, was in search of a wife to secure a powerful alliance. Charles was a ruler plagued by internal rebellion and external threats. His kingdom, already weak and divided, was on the brink of collapse. The marriage to Richilde, the daughter of a nobleman with ties to the south, was a strategic maneuver, one that could give him control over the lands of Provence and perhaps stem the tides of unrest. Though the union was largely a political one, Richilde and Charles the Bald were not strangers to each other. Their marriage, which took place in 870, was more than a union of two people, it was a union of two legacies. Charles, though once a mighty ruler, was now faced with a kingdom teetering on the edge of ruin. His reign had been marked by wars with his brothers and the persistent threat of Viking invasions. As the first wife of the king, Richilde was thrust into a role she had little time to prepare for. The marriage brought Richilde not only a crown but also a kingdom. Provence, a rich and fertile land, now belonged to Charles the Bald through their union. It was a world unlike any she had known, one of royal courts, treacherous advisors, and delicate negotiations. But in the grand halls of her new home, Richilde had little say in the matters that affected her most, while her husband, Charles, dealt with the pressing threats to his realm. She was expected to play her part in the dance of courtly life. For the first few years of her marriage, Richilde's world seemed to be one of luxury and power. She was surrounded by other women of the court, each one vying for her attention and favor. But the political tensions that surrounded her were never far from the surface. It wasn't long before Richilde realized that her beauty, youth, and charm, qualities that had won her a place in the king's heart, were far less important than the alliances her marriage could secure. Charles, despite his political acumen, was not a man without his flaws. His obsession with maintaining control over his kingdom left him little time for his queen, and he was constantly embroiled in wars both near and far. Richilde, though young and inexperienced, had a keen sense of duty. She understood that her role was more than that of a mere consort. She was the mother of the future heirs to the throne, and it was her responsibility to ensure their survival in a world where the next rebellion or assassination was always just around the corner. In the years following their marriage, Richilde bore Charles several children, securing her place as the matriarch of the royal family. However, the birth of her children was not enough to shield her from the political machinations that unfolded around her. As Charles the Bald's reign became increasingly unstable, Richilde found herself caught between loyalty to her husband and the demands of the nobles who sought to undermine him. Her kingdom, once a promising prize, was slipping through her fingers like sand, and the threats to her children's future grew ever greater. In the year 877, when the winds of fate turned cold and cruel, the life of Richilde took a fateful and irreversible turn. Charles the Bald, her husband, whose crown had once gleamed with the promise of power, fell ill. The king, in his later years, had been weakened by a combination of stress, political strife, and perhaps the encroaching hand of old age. As his health failed, it became evident that the empire he had fought so fiercely to maintain would soon be without a ruler. It was then that Richilde, already the mother of his children, was forced to confront the daunting task of holding the fragile threads of her family's future together. Charles the Bald's death did not come as a surprise to those who had closely watched the disintegration of his reign. But for Richilde, it was a moment of profound personal loss. Her husband, once a man of ambition, had ultimately left behind a kingdom in tatters. His death did not bring an end to the turmoil. Rather, sparked a new wave of conflicts, as the empire was left without a central figure to guide it. His sons from various marriages began to vie for dominance, each seeking to carve out their own territories in the wake of their father's demise. Richilde's position was precarious. She was no longer simply the wife of the king. She was now the widow of a ruler whose legacy was in jeopardy. As the mother of his children, she stood as the protector of their inheritance and their claim to the throne. But in a world ruled by men, her power was often questioned. In many ways, Richilde's struggle was just beginning, as the court of West Francia became a battlefield of ambition, betrayal, and shifting alliances. In the days following Charles the Bald's death, Richilde found herself thrust into the complex game of power, one where survival often meant aligning oneself with enemies or making uneasy compromises. Her first move was to seek the protection of the powerful noblemen of Provence, the very region that had brought her marriage to Charles. The Provence, rich in resources and strategic importance, could offer her leverage. She made it clear that she intended to hold onto the territories her husband had acquired through their union. But the nobles, ever calculating, knew that her position was vulnerable. They were not willing to place their trust in a woman, even one as capable as Richilde. At the heart of the political struggle was Charles the Bald's eldest son, Louis the Stammerer, who ascended to the throne of West Francia after his father's death. Yet, his reign was marked by the same struggles that had plagued his father's. Like Charles, Louis was not a man who could easily command the loyalty of his people. His stutter, a physical manifestation of his inner uncertainties, seemed to echo the instability that ran through the veins of the Carolingian dynasty. Louis, recognizing the importance of Provence and the strategic value of Richilde, sought an alliance with her. He offered her security in exchange for her support. But Richilde, no naive princess, understood that loyalty in this world was a currency that could be bought and sold as easily as land. Her loyalty was not given freely, and she made it clear that she would not be a passive player in the court's intrigues. Her children, after all, were heirs to the legacy of Charles the Bald. Their claim to power was as much her concern as it was theirs. Richilde's role in the court of West Francia was increasingly that of a shadow ruler, one whose influence could not be easily measured by titles or appearances. She carefully navigated the intricate web of power, ever watchful of those who would seek to undermine her children's future. But in a court filled with intrigue, alliances were fickle, and no trust could be taken for granted. She found herself aligning with various factions, none of them entirely loyal, but each offering a measure of security. She understood that her survival, and the survival of her children, depended not only on military power or wealth, but also on the subtle art of negotiation. Richilde's relationship with her son, Charles the Bald's second son and her own flesh and blood, was one of protection and strategy. His name was Louis, and though young, he had inherited the ambitious spirit of his forefathers. Richilde could see the fire in his eyes, a fire that mirrored her own. She knew that Louis's fate, like hers, was bound to the ever-changing tides of politics. As his mother, it was her duty to prepare him for the battles ahead, not just for territory, but for survival. But not all her decisions were made with the direct interests of her children in mind. She had to consider her own place in a world that offered few opportunities for a woman to wield power. In the court of West Francia, women were seen as pawns to be married off or used to cement alliances. Richilde was no exception to this view. Yet, She was determined not to be relegated to the sidelines. Her intellect, her understanding of power dynamics, and her ability to navigate the complexities of court politics made her an indispensable figure, even if her influence was often obscured by the men who surrounded her. As the years passed, Richilde's efforts to secure her children's future began to take shape. Her son Louis was now old enough to command an army, and with Richilde's guidance, he began to establish himself as a capable leader. But despite their best efforts, the kingdom remained fractured. The factions that had once supported Charles the Bald now turned against one another, each vying for control of the territories that had once been part of his kingdom. Richilde's hopes for a lasting peace were dashed in 882, when Louis, her eldest son, died unexpectedly. It was a blow that would shake the foundations of her plans. The death of Louis left her with a void that could not easily be filled. Her other sons were still too young to step into the void left by their brother, and the kingdom that had once been their birthright seemed further from their grasp than ever before. The death of her son marked the beginning of a new phase in Richilde's life. She was no longer simply the queen mother, but a woman who had experienced both the highs and lows of royal life. She had buried a husband, watched the death of a son, and witnessed the collapse of an empire that had once promised so much. Yet through it all, Richilde's resolve remained unbroken. Richilde's power would continue to shift as the years passed. By the time her second son, Charles the Simple, ascended to the throne in 893, Richilde's role in the court had become one of quiet influence. Her position was no longer one of overt power, but her experience and wisdom made her a valuable advisor. Though she was no longer the Queen of West Francia, Richilde's legacy remained a testament to the resilience of a woman who had navigated the most treacherous waters of her time. The final years of Richilde's life were marked by the same political turbulence that had shaped the beginning of her journey. Yet, in her twilight years, she could look back with a sense of quiet pride. She had done her duty, not just as a wife and mother, but as a ruler in her own right. Though her name may have faded from the records of history, Richilde of Provence had carved her place in the tumultuous history of the Carolingian Empire. The death of Louis the Stammerer in 882 marked the true beginning of Richilde's evolution from a queen consort to a political matriarch in the fractured world of the Carolingian Empire. She was no longer merely the wife of a monarch or the mother of heirs. She was now a widow with a powerful legacy to protect. The death of her son, Louis the Stammerer, had been a devastating blow to her personal hopes, but it also deepened her resolve. Richilde had seen firsthand how fragile the throne was, how easily it could slip from the grasp of the most well-meaning rulers. In the wake of Louis's untimely death, she knew that if she was to safeguard the future of her family, she would have to act swiftly and decisively. Though Richilde's son Charles the Simple was now poised to inherit the throne of West Francia, he was far too young to assume real power. His reign would depend on the strength and guidance of those around him. Richilde understood that her role, though no longer officially royal, remained paramount. In the coming years, she would become the chief advisor to her son, shaping his path and securing his place in the turbulent world of Carolingian politics. But the political landscape of West Francia was one marked by relentless instability. The Carolingian dynasty was now a shadow of its former glory. The once mighty empire, which had stretched across much of Europe under Charlemagne, had fractured into smaller kingdoms, each led by a descendant of the great emperor. The descendants of Charlemagne were not united by a single vision, but instead by constant rivalry and ambition. The result was a fractured and chaotic political environment where loyalty was a commodity and alliances were often as short-lived as they were fragile. Richilde, knowing the dangers of this environment, became a master of alliances and diplomacy. She reached out to the nobles of Provence, who had long been loyal to her family, seeking their support to solidify her son's claim to the throne. But even in Provence, there were rivals who sought to undermine her, hoping to take advantage of her weakened position. Richilde's political acumen, honed through years of navigating the treacherous corridors of Carolingian courts, would soon be tested in ways she had never imagined. Her first significant challenge came in the form of Robert the Strong, a powerful noble from the region of Neustria. Robert had been one of Charles the Bald's most trusted commanders, and he had continued to exert considerable influence after Charles's death. Seeing the vulnerability of the young King Charles the Simple, Robert sought to claim power for himself, hoping to steer the course of the kingdom in a direction that suited his interests. He was a man of ambition, and he did not shy away from using any means necessary to achieve his goals. Richilde, however, was no stranger to political intrigue. She understood that Robert's ambitions were not just a personal threat, but a threat to the legacy of her family. Her response was swift and decisive. She used her considerable influence to rally the noble houses of Provence, leveraging her family's ties and her own reputation as a skilled diplomat. She also sought support from the kingdom's clergy, many of whom had been sympathetic to the Carolingian cause. By consolidating her alliances, she was able to push back against Robert's ambitions, forcing him into a temporary retreat. But in the world of Frankish politics, there were always new players waiting to take the place of those who fell. Meanwhile, Charles the Simple's reign continued to be marked by internal strife. His throne was perpetually under siege from rival factions, and he struggled to maintain control over the territories that had once been part of his father's kingdom. Though he was a man of intellect and ambition, Charles lacked the strength and decisiveness of his forefathers. It was during these trying times that Richilde's influence grew. She knew that her son's reign could not be solely based on his bloodline. It had to be fortified by the alliances and relationships that she could create. Her power was, however, often obscured by the public nature of Charles's rule. While Charles may have sat upon the throne, it was Richilde who often made the key decisions behind closed doors. Her role as a queen mother was one of quiet power, and her ability to maneuver through the shifting alliances of the court made her an indispensable force. It was said that her counsel was worth more than the military might of any knight, for Richilde knew how to play the political game with an insight that few could match. Yet, Richilde's influence was not without its costs. The political world she inhabited was one where betrayal was common, and even the closest of allies could turn on you in an instant. Her relationship with the nobility, though largely cordial, was also one marked by deep mistrust. The nobles of West Francia, many of whom had risen to power through the collapse of the central monarchy, saw Richilde not as a queen mother but as a reminder of a time that had passed. Her role in the court was that of a relic, a vestige of a dying dynasty that they sought to replace with their own. Richilde was constantly reminded that the power she held was as tenuous as the alliances she relied on. But Richilde was not one to yield easily. She understood the precariousness of her position, and she took steps to ensure her survival. One of her greatest triumphs came in 888, when Charles the Simple was crowned King of West Francia. The coronation was an event of great significance, as it marked the official recognition of Charles as the legitimate heir to the throne. Richilde, having spent years securing her son's claim, was finally able to see her efforts come to fruition. Her son, once a boy with no power, was now king. The coronation, however, was not the end of Richilde's political machinations. She knew that her son's reign would be short-lived if he could not consolidate his power and neutralize the threats to his rule. With the help of her loyal supporters, Richilde began to strengthen the monarchy by centralizing authority and suppressing the growing power of the regional lords. Her leadership was critical during these early years, as West Francia was still embroiled in civil wars and Viking invasions. It was Richilde's ability to hold together the kingdom during these turbulent times that earned her a reputation as one of the most formidable women in medieval Europe. Despite the challenges she faced, Richilde's life was not without its moments of personal joy. In 893, her son Charles the Simple married the daughter of the powerful Duke of the Franks, which helped solidify his power base. The marriage was a significant political move that further solidified Richilde's position. It was during this period that Richilde, now in her later years, began to take a more passive role in court politics. While she still wielded influence behind the scenes, she increasingly left the day-to-day affairs of the kingdom to her son and his advisors. By the end of the 9th century, Richilde's influence was beginning to wane. Her son, Charles the Simple, had firmly established himself as king, and the power struggles that had once dominated her life seemed to be fading into the background. Yet, despite her reduced role, Richilde's legacy lived on. She had successfully guided her son through the political minefield of Carolingian Europe, securing the throne for him at great personal cost. The year was 893, and though the kingdom of West Francia had endured countless crises and upheavals, Richilde, the once queen consort and then widow, remained a silent but powerful force behind the throne. Her son, Charles the Simple, had ascended to the throne amidst great tumult, and for a brief moment, the fractured pieces of the Carolingian Empire seemed to settle into place. West Francia had a king, albeit one who lacked the iron fist of his forefathers, and it was this very weakness that would drive Richilde's next steps. In these later years of her life, Richilde had earned the respect, even fear, of the kingdom's elite. Her role as Queen Mother had evolved from that of a regal, albeit secondary, figure to one of a strategist, an unseen hand that guided her son's reign from the shadows. While she had relinquished her active role in court life, her influence remained undeniable. The political world was still one of constant flux, with shifting alliances and the ever-present threat of rebellion. But Richilde's years of experience gave her an unparalleled understanding of how to navigate its treacherous waters. Her primary concern now was securing the throne for her son, Charles the Simple, but it was a task fraught with difficulties. Charles, despite his deep intelligence and strong will, was never a man of great strength. He lacked the military prowess and the strategic genius of his forebears. Unlike Charlemagne, who had expanded the empire with an iron grip, Charles the Simple was a ruler surrounded by ambitious nobles, each seeking to carve out their own power. It was a world in which loyalty was fleeting, and alliances were fragile. Richilde's strategy was one of careful diplomacy, forging alliances not only with the traditional powerhouses of West Francia, such as the nobles of Provence and Burgundy, but also with the church. The clergy, particularly the bishops and abbots of the region, wielded enormous influence in the Carolingian world. The church, though often seen as a spiritual institution, was also deeply entangled in the political machinations of the time. Richilde, understanding this, worked tirelessly to secure the support of the church for her son's reign, cementing her family's ties to both temporal and spiritual power. But no matter how carefully she arranged the pieces of her political puzzle, Richilde was never blind to the dangers of her position. The rise of the powerful Robertians, descendants of Robert the Strong, who had once been a rival for power in West Francia, remained a persistent threat to her son's authority. The Robertians, led by Robert I, had amassed significant support in the north and had even briefly taken the throne before being ousted. Their ambitions were never far from the surface, and their rivalry with the Carolingians would shape the political landscape for years to come. It was in this tense climate that Richilde made one of the most important decisions of her later years. She understood that in order to secure Charles's throne and protect his legacy, she would need to neutralize the threat posed by the Robertians. The Robertian faction, led by Robert I and his son, Hugh the Great, had begun to consolidate power in the north. Their growing influence threatened to topple the fragile balance of power in West Francia. Richilde knew that military intervention would be disastrous. The Carolingian kingdom, still recovering from the internal fractures that had led to Charles's ascension, could not afford another war. But diplomacy, this was Richilde's true weapon. She carefully played on the rivalries within the Robertian faction, exploiting their weaknesses and offering them carefully crafted promises in exchange for their support. Slowly but surely, she eroded the Robertian influence, creating divisions between the northern lords and their southern counterparts. Richild's shrewdness paid off. By the time Charles the Simple began to consolidate his power in the early 900s, the Robertians, although still a force to be reckoned with, had been significantly weakened. Yet, as ever in the court of West Francia, there were new threats emerging. In 897, a new challenge arrived in the form of the Viking invasions, which had once again begun to ravage the northern coast. These raids were not only a military challenge, but a direct attack on the legitimacy of the Carolingian rulers. The Vikings, with their swift ships and deadly warriors, were a force that no king could ignore. Their raids were an existential threat to the kingdom's security, and Richilde knew that her son, already under siege from internal factions, could not afford to let the kingdom be torn apart by the external threat of the Norsemen. Richilde's response was, once again, one of political brilliance. She brokered a deal with the Viking leader, Rollo of Normandy, offering him land and protection in exchange for his loyalty. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911, which saw Rollo become the first Duke of Normandy, was a masterstroke of diplomacy. The Viking threat to West Francia was mitigated, and Charles the Simple, though weakened by internal struggles, was now seen as a legitimate ruler in the eyes of foreign powers. Rollo's loyalty, though often questioned in later years, gave Charles a degree of stability that was desperately needed. As Charles's reign continued, Richilde's role began to diminish, not because her influence had waned, but because the political landscape had shifted. By now, Charles was firmly in control of his realm, and his political acumen had developed significantly. However, Richilde's work was far from done. She had ensured the survival of her son's reign, and in doing so, had cemented her place in history. Yet, there were still challenges to overcome. In 922, after years of managing the throne from behind the scenes, Richilde witnessed another dramatic shift in the political world. Charles the Simple, despite his earlier successes, had become increasingly isolated. His dealings with the nobles, particularly his reliance on a small circle of advisors, alienated many of the powerful figures within West Francia. The noble class, always fickle, began to lose faith in Charles, and a rebellion broke out in 922. In the midst of this turmoil, Richilde's legacy was brought into sharper focus. Her son, despite all her efforts, was imprisoned, and the kingdom was once again thrown into chaos. However, Richilde's presence in the court and her undying loyalty to her family's legacy left a lasting imprint. Though Charles would be dethroned and ultimately forced into exile, Richilde's role as the architect of his reign was undeniable. She had played her part in securing a throne that would not last, but her influence on the political structures of West Francia would resonate for years to come. The year was 922, and the once mighty empire that had been forged by Charlemagne's hands had long since crumbled into fractured kingdoms and rival territories. Richilde of Provence, now in the twilight years of her life, could no longer avoid the reality of her situation. Her son, Charles the Simple, had ruled West Francia for many years, yet his reign was marred by instability, rebellion, and growing unrest among the nobility. Despite the political skill and deft alliances Richilde had fostered, the ever-present threat of discontent was no longer something that could be managed from behind the scenes. Charles, though once a ruler with potential, had become increasingly isolated from the very forces that had helped propel him to power. His failure to navigate the turbulent waters of nobility, the continuous friction between the court and the powerful lords of West Francia, had created a situation in which rebellion was inevitable. The nobles had grown tired of his reliance on a small circle of loyal advisors, many of whom were seen as weak and ineffectual in the face of mounting external and internal challenges. Richilde had long been the cornerstone of her son's reign, the unseen hand that had quietly, but decisively, steered the course of West Francia's survival. But as the years wore on, it became apparent that her efforts, though monumental, had not been enough to secure a lasting legacy for the Carolingians. The intricate alliances she had built with the church, the nobility, and the rising forces of the Viking clans now seemed fragile, ready to break apart under the strain of growing dissatisfaction. For the first time in her life, Richilde had no political tools left at her disposal to protect the throne her family had once held. The rebellion of 922 was the culmination of years of simmering tension. Led by powerful nobles and military commanders, the revolt was not simply a rebellion against Charles the Simple, but a repudiation of the Carolingian family's rule. The lords who had once been loyal allies to Charles the Bald and Charles the Simple now turned their swords against their king. Richilde watched helplessly as the powerful nobles of Neustria, Burgundy, and Aquitaine marched against her son's court. The bitter truth was that West Francia was no longer united. It was a fractured kingdom, splintered into fiefdoms, each controlled by lords more interested in their own power than in preserving the legacy of the Carolingians. Charles the Simple was taken prisoner and forced into exile, his reign abruptly cut short after more than 2 decades. The kingdom that he had inherited, once vast and prosperous, was no longer under his control. As her son was stripped of his crown, Richilde knew her own power had come to an end. She, too, would be left to navigate a world that had grown increasingly hostile to the Carolingian legacy. But what became of Richilde in the aftermath of her son's deposition? How did this formidable woman, who had been a queen, a strategist, and the guardian of a dynasty, find herself in the declining years of her life? History offers little in the way of details, but it is clear that Richilde's fate was marked by the shifting tides of power in France. She was not executed, nor was she cast into complete obscurity, but she was no longer the force she had once been. After Charles the Simple's exile, Richilde's role as a political power broker diminished. West Francia's attention shifted to the growing influence of the Robertians and the rise of Hugh the Great, the powerful son of Robert the Strong, who would soon be seen as the new master of the kingdom. Richilde's own survival depended on her ability to adapt to a world in which she no longer held the keys to power. She sought refuge in her ancestral lands of Provence, a region that had been a cornerstone of her family's power for decades. Though Provence had been subject to the political machinations of the Carolingian court for many years, it had retained a degree of autonomy, and it was in these southern territories that Richilde could still exert some influence. She may have no longer been a queen in title, but in Provence, she remained a respected figure, a reminder of a past era when the Carolingians had ruled with near absolute power. Yet even in Provence, Richilde was not immune to the shifting power dynamics of the medieval world. The growing influence of the local nobility, particularly the House of the Beausonets, threatened her standing. The Beausonets, once loyal to the Carolingians, were now positioning themselves as the new rulers of Provence, and their growing power made it clear that Richilde's influence was waning. Despite her best efforts to retain control, Richilde was eventually forced to accept a secondary role in the kingdom's politics. Her voice, once so powerful in the court of Charles the Bald, was no longer the deciding factor in the decisions that shaped the fate of France. Richilde's final years were marked by a quiet retreat from the public eye. She had weathered countless storms, from the death of her first husband to the betrayals of the nobility, and from the turmoil of her son's reign to his ultimate downfall. Now, she was left to reflect on the legacy she had worked so hard to build. Though her son had failed to hold the throne, Richilde's actions had ensured that the Carolingian family did not fade entirely from history. She had steered the course of events during some of the most tumultuous years of West Francia's history, and her influence, while indirect in her later years, had still shaped the course of the kingdom. As for the larger political world, by the time of Richilde's death, the Carolingians were no longer the dominant force they had once been. The rise of the Robertian dynasty, led by Hugh the Great and later his son Hugh Capet, marked the end of Carolingian rule in West Francia. In 987, Hugh Capet would ascend to the throne, founding the Capetian dynasty that would rule France for centuries to come. The fall of the Carolingians, however, did not erase Richilde's legacy. She had played a key role in the political affairs of her time, and her actions had left an indelible mark on the Carolingian Empire. Even as it collapsed, Richilde's death, though unremarkable in historical records, signaled the end of an era. She had lived through the height of the Carolingian Empire, the reign of Charles the Bald, the tumultuous reign of Charles the Simple, and the eventual decline of her family's power. But through it all, she had remained a figure of influence, a testament to the enduring power of a woman who navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics with intelligence and determination. Her story, though largely forgotten by the annals of history, remains one of resilience. Richilde of Provence was a woman who, through love and loss, diplomacy and intrigue, and a relentless drive to preserve her family's legacy, left a quiet but powerful imprint on the history of medieval France. Though the kingdom she had once hoped to secure for her children would fall into the hands of others, her role in its preservation is undeniable. She was, for a time, a queen in more than just name, a queen in action, whose legacy continued to echo in the corridors of power long after her death. Richilde of Provence, once a queen consort, mother, and political matriarch, had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the ebb and flow of power, and the shifting tides of history. As the years wore on and her son's reign ended in exile, Richilde's life, once so intricately entwined with the fate of West Francia, seemed to settle into the shadows of history. Yet, even in the waning years of her life, Richilde's presence and her influence were far from forgotten. Though the political landscape of Europe had shifted, the echoes of her actions, her political machinations, and her resilience would continue to reverberate long after her death. As the year 936 approached, Richilde found herself living in relative seclusion in Provence. No longer the center of political power, she was now an elder stateswoman, watching as the kingdom she had worked so tirelessly to protect slipped further away from the hands of her family. The Carolingian Dynasty, once the mighty force that had united much of Western Europe, was no more. Charles the Bald's once expansive empire had been divided, and his heirs, including her son Charles the Simple, had failed to maintain it. In 987, a final blow to the Carolingian dynasty came when Hugh Capet, leader of the Robertians, was crowned King of France. This marked the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, which would endure for centuries, securing a legacy of power and stability that had eluded the Carolingians in their final years. Charles the Simple, once so promising, had been abandoned by his nobles, imprisoned, and exiled. His mother, Richilde, had fought for his reign, but the political world of Francia was unforgiving. Her ability to protect him had faded as the influence of the Carolingian family waned. Richilde's heart was heavy with the loss of her son's kingdom, but her sense of duty to her family's name remained intact. She knew the game of power was fickle, and despite the misfortune of her son, the Carolingians had once ruled with greatness. It was now the task of future generations to understand their legacy, however flawed it might have been. In her final years, Richilde took solace in the idea that her political efforts, her diplomacy, and her guidance had not been in vain. Though the world around her was changing, the history of her family, though marked by failure, would still be remembered. In Provence, Richilde's influence was still respected, though by now, her powers were mostly ceremonial. The Beausonets, the once loyal noble house that had become rivals for control of the region, had solidified their hold over the southern territories of France. Their ascendancy had been fueled by the decline of the Carolingians, and Richilde's legacy as the queen mother and political player was now relegated to a quieter role. But Richilde had been a woman of action, and in the court of Provence, she was still regarded as an elder stateswoman who had navigated the complex world of Carolingian politics with unparalleled skill. Though her hands were no longer on the levers of power, her mind remained sharp. She understood the new dynamics of medieval Europe, the rise of the Carolingian Dynasty, the increasing influence of the Church, and the shifting relationships between the powerful families of France. Richilde still entertained the occasional visitor, and her advice, though no longer sought by the court of Paris, was still occasionally sought by those in Provence who recognized her unique understanding of the political landscape. Her final years were marked by reflection. She had witnessed the rise of the Carolingian dynasty under Charlemagne, the fractured reigns of his descendants, and the eventual demise of the family. She had seen kingdoms rise and fall, and she had personally borne witness to the fading power of her son's line. Yet she held no bitterness, at least none that history could detect. She had been a mother who did what she could for her son, and in that, she found peace. History does not record the exact date of Richilde's death, but by the mid-940s, she had faded into the background of European politics. No longer the powerful political figure who had once wielded great influence behind the throne of West Francia. She was now a woman who had lived through the height of an empire and seen it collapse. She passed from this world as quietly as she had lived in her later years, away from the bustling courts of Paris and the political intrigues of the medieval world. Her death was mourned not as that of a queen, but as that of a matriarch who had navigated some of the most turbulent years in French history. Though her son's reign had ended in failure, and the Carolingians had been ousted from power, Richilde's role in shaping the course of events could not be easily overlooked. She had been one of the last major political figures to carry the Carolingian legacy, and in her life, the history of a once great empire lived on. In the years following Richilde's death, the history of the Carolingians continued to be written. But the true extent of Richilde's role in preserving her family's legacy was slowly obscured by the rise of the Capetians and the growing centralization of power in Paris. However, there are subtle reminders of Richilde's influence in the political landscape of her time. Though she had lost the throne for her son, Richilde had given him the tools to rule, and had fought tenaciously to preserve his power. It was she who had played the pivotal role in the negotiations with the Viking leader Rollo, thus securing the treaty that would shape the future of Normandy and its relationship with the French crown. It was Richilde who had played the role of a quiet but powerful queen mother, maintaining her family's hold on power through diplomacy and alliances. Her legacy, though it did not result in the enduring reign of her son, paved the way for the consolidation of power in the emerging feudal system. Her ability to navigate court politics, to build alliances, and to maintain influence in a fractured political environment helped shape the early Middle Ages. Even as the Carolingian dynasty faded into history, Richilde's actions left an imprint on the political culture of medieval Europe. The Capetians, after all, would find their power solidified through a combination of strategic marriages, alliances with the church, and the loyalty of the nobility, tools that Richilde had mastered long before. Though the Carolingian dynasty would no longer rule the Kingdom of France, the legacy of its rulers, embodied in figures like Richilde, would not be forgotten. The Carolingian Renaissance, a brief but brilliant period of intellectual and cultural flourishing, had set the stage for the medieval world that followed. Richilde, with her sharp political mind and understanding of the delicate balance of power, was one of the last guardians of that great tradition. The life of Richilde of Provence reminds us that the true power of monarchs, especially those who lived in the shadow of larger-than-life figures like Charlemagne, was not always measured by the thrones they occupied or the armies they commanded. Richilde's legacy was not one of military conquest or territorial expansion, but of subtle diplomacy, careful political maneuvering, and a tireless dedication to the preservation of her family's name. Her story stands as a testament to the strength of women in medieval Europe, even in an era when their political power was often relegated to the background. Richilde was a queen in name only, but in action, she was as powerful and influential as any king of her time. She had the foresight to understand the changing tides of politics and the tenacity to secure her family's future in an increasingly unstable world. Her life, though marked by personal tragedy and political failure, was one of remarkable resilience and wisdom. And so, Richilde of Provence faded from history, but her legacy lived on. She was a queen who, in the end, gave all she had to preserve her family's honor, and in doing so, she secured a place in the history of medieval France that would not soon be forgotten.